Salutations from space and aloha from Earth, friends. You came in hearing the music of the wonderful County Road X, an old band of my dear friend Eric Deutsch, wonderful piano player and composer. And you were hearing the trumpet of John Gray, another dear friend of mine. If I Had My Way, you would have been listening to Live at the Lighthouse by Lee Morgan, because Lee Morgan, though we can't have Lee Morgan's amazing trumpet soundtrack our journey here, or else this thing would just get taken down as quickly as it's put up, all right? But Lee Morgan is going to soundtrack our astrological journey here today. I just the other night watched this amazing film that came out somewhat recently about the great Lee Morgan called I Called Him Morgan. And I definitely recommend it. I will say it's a pretty heavy story. Lee Morgan, like so many amazing jazz musicians of the day, struggled with heroin greatly at a time in his life. But he was also kind of taken out of the gutter by his a woman who would eventually become his wife, or at least his common law wife. And a challenging thing to hear here, friends, but Lee Morgan's life also ended at her hand. She shot him when he was out playing a show in New York because he had started spending his time with another woman. So it's a powerful film. I highly suggest checking it out. I Called Him Morgan, and certainly check out the amazing music of the great Lee Morgan, one of the most important jazz musicians to have graced our ears, and have very much kind of defined the blue note sound, and spent time with Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers, and Dizzy Gillespie before that, and really just creating his own music and running wonderful bands. And then he kind of fell out of the scene, falling prey to drugs, and then came back and sadly died at a very young age, 33 years old. Now, one of the reasons why I wanted to share this today is because, well, anytime these days as an astrologer I hear such a powerful story of life, I'm interested in investigating this astrologically, and so look for a birth chart on time instantly. Now, for Lee Morgan, we don't know the time of his birth, which is why in parentheses you see time question mark, all right? And typically I'll cast like a 12 p.m. chart when I don't know a birth time, because that's going to give me like the medium position for the moon on this calendar date, right? I know that Lee Morgan was born on July 10th, 1938 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, but I just don't know what time. And so one thing I wanted to speak about here today is, what do you do when you don't know a birth time? Like, can you still astrologize? The answer is absolutely yes. But the more astrology you learn, the more you tend to appreciate the delineations available through astrological houses and through the essence of the astrological angles. And all of this is described and defined by the specific time of birth, all right? Now, a really wonderful question is, well, what is the specific time of birth, right? Like, should I trust that thing that's written on my birth certificate? I mean, for me, I have 7:39 p.m. on my birth certificate, and that feels like, they didn't round up or round down too far, right? I'll also say I was born in a hospital, right? Astrology often suggests that our birth or our becoming here in this world is kind of keyed to our first breath. Well, I mean, interestingly, in a hospital birth, like, that time on the birth record and the first breath are likely pretty close because, you're delivered, they cut the cord and they spank you to see if you can cry, right? And so then you're taking a breath. Like, children born at home are often, they're earth side, it's called, when they kind of are fully cleared from mother. But then they're typically laid on mother's side, like if there aren't complications and things are cool. And it'll look like the child's breathing. I mean, it'll look like a baby's breathing if they're born head first, as most of us are, even before they're completely earth side. But they're not. They're still breathing through the unbiblical cord, And so the baby will be laid on mother's side, typically, and it might be 20, 30 minutes, maybe even an hour before the cord is cut. And I understand what happens is though it looks like the child's breathing, they're actually still receiving their air through the mother's cord, well, the cord they share. Um, and then when the baby does breathe independently, then hormones are sent back through the cord to let mother know that the cord's no longer necessary. And then blood stops pumping through it. And I guess this is something you can like visibly notice. And then that's typically when the cord is cut, like in a natural birth, let me say a home birth, right? And again, it can be 10, 15, 20, 30 minutes, even an hour after the baby is earthside, from what I've been told, because I always ask when I find somebody who's a midwife or a doula, like, when is a child born? What does that look like? I mean, interestingly, here in the United States where I live, there's literally different criterion for a birth moment from one state to another. Some use like crowning, some use earthside. And if we do go with this idea of first breath, which is a beautiful philosophy as well, it's hard to know, especially in a home birth. And in a sense, if you have like a hospital birth record and you were spanked so shortly after you were earthside and demanding you to take a breath to make sure that you can breathe on your own, maybe you could have more confidence in your birth time. But all master astrologers suggest that regardless of birth record, all birth times should be rectified, and typically by somebody that's not you or somebody close to you, because we're so biased. um, I will say I've not done this with my chart yet. I use my birth record, my birth certificate time, 7:39 p.m. In some softwares, for me, I like using 7:39:02 p.m. And because it puts 9:36 Gemini on the rise instead of 9:35. And there's something about 9, 3, and 6 that really excites me. Many of the softwares actually do show 9:36 at 7:39 p.m. my birth record time, because with so many arc seconds it rounds up to that. But the software that I mostly use now, which is this Astro Gold software for the Mac, gives me 9:35 Gemini, so I literally add 2 seconds for that. Now that's not rectification, right? That's like preferred numerology, and definitely not the recommended approach, right? So what do we do when we don't have a native's birth time, right? Like, this is a case I experience not too frequently, but frequently enough as a consulting astrologer. Somebody comes without a birth time. They might have a range. They might say, mom said 9 a.m., but dad was sure it was 11 p.m. We have, for Paul McCartney, in one source, a biography, 2 a.m. In another source, when he was asked by Lewis Rodin of the Rodin ratings of his astrological system for, I guess, verifying birth times and having confidence in one time versus another. Paul McCartney told Lewis Rodin that he was born at 2 p.m. Right? So is it 2 a.m. or 2 p.m., Sir Paul? Or maybe neither of those things, because you'd rather us not know, or whatever, right? So for Lee Morgan, we just don't know. We're certainly not going to be able to ask Lee Morgan here on Earth, because sadly he died in 1972. Maybe somebody could channel in Lee, or what we do in astrology is use our timing techniques, right, for significant events, like perhaps that first show that he played with Dizzy Gillespie when he was like 16 years old. Dizzy brought Lee in, and that was a really cool thing to see in this film, this movie. I Called Him Morgan. Some of like his peers describing how amazing that was when Lee was brought in as a 16-year-old to Dizzy Gillespie's band. Later in the film, he said 18 years old. So that's something I'd really want to track down, grab the biography, or, maybe go to this place to start online just because it's easy. But I don't know that I would always trust it. I don't know. Maybe I can search 16 here and see if we get 16 years old. We don't, but we do get this. Lee and Helen Morgan are the subjects of a 2016 documentary called I Called Him Morgan. And charts work even after we leave this mortal plane, especially for people who leave such everlasting notes behind as Lee Morgan did, right? And so I would look at timing techniques even here for when this film premiered September 1st, 2016 at the 73rd Venice Film Festival, and then was theatrically released on March 24th, 2017. Like, for me, that's intriguing. These would be dates that maybe we could look to. But the time when Lee Morgan's first record, Lee Morgan Indeed, was released might be a little bit more interesting in Lee Morgan's life, right? And all of these different times, look at all of these different records, and different gigs he played, and etc. Maybe his connections with other people who were really significant in his life, like his wife, Helen Morgan, who's, I can't even find her birth date, by the way, or like Art Blakey, or Dizzy Gillespie, or Wayne Shorter, or Benny Maupin, or, other people, Bobby Timmons, that Lee played with and spent so much time with, etc., Let me see if I search Dizzy. What happens here? We get Morgan recorded prolifically from 56 until a day before his death in February 72. He joined Dizzy Gillespie's big band at 18, so here not 16 at all, and remained as a member for a year and a half until economic circumstances. So, what can I do with 18? I could try to do some research historically and find that exact date. Coltrane, is another person I've been studying recently, specifically to get ready to teach a class on the fifth harmonic, so that for another time. But Lee Morgan was on Coltrane's amazing and heralded album called Blue Train, which was recorded in 1957. Like, I could look to that date, right? And so looking at how these different timing techniques play against Lee Morgan's chart might help me understand a thing or two about him, but also might help me rectify his birth time, right? So, like, here's a pretty important time in Lee Morgan's life, which is the end of it, when he was shot in the club by his wife. And it was pretty, powerful to hear her describe that moment in this film, I Called Him Morgan, and also to hear it described by members in his band. So again, I highly recommend that. I mean, interestingly, when I cast this 12 p.m. time, just because that will tell me, the medium position of the moon, for example. Interestingly, I see Pluto and Black Moon Lilith here hanging out at the ascendant for 12 p.m. on the day of Lee Morgan's birth. Say another thing about that, like, let me go back 12 hours before this time. Oh, let me do that in this way. That won't have me lose Lee's chart. All right, so this is this 12 a.m. time. Sorry, 12 p.m., right? July 10th, 1938. Look at the moon. The moon, who moves most quickly through the zodiac. Here, she's near the galactic center degree, which is right there in 1938. But if I go back 12 hours, well, the moon's going to be about 6 hours shy of that position, 20 and a half Sag. How do I know? The moon moves like 13 degrees per day. When Lee Morgan was born, the moon was moving slowly. And how do I know? Because true Black Moon Lilith directs our hearts towards the lunar apogee, where the moon is furthest from Earth every month, and therefore moving slowest because furthest from their shared gravitational source. All right. So at 12 a.m. on this calendar day in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, we have the moon in the 21st degree of Sagittarius, at 12 p.m. at the 27th degree of Sagittarius, and then at 12 a.m. on the next calendar day, right, so the end of that day, we have the moon into Capricorn. So I might even wonder, it's going to be about 4 hours before this time, when the moon moved from Sagittarius to Capricorn. That can really help with a rectification. When you have the great gift of seeing a chart that is untimed, where the moon changes signs during that day, because that helps us understand, like, archetypally, an option for this being, like, besides truths that, like, when the moon comes into Capricorn on this day, she will sextile Pisces Jupiter, she will oppose Cancer Chiron. That's not something I would be saying as much so, though the geometry is true and the moon's in Sagittarius. I'm more inclined to look first and foremost to, like, moon trine Venus, for example, okay? Moon only changes signs on average every 2.3 days. So it's kind of a rare gift. Not rare, but you don't always receive an untimed birth chart where the moon changes signs. Last time I was here live on YouTube, and my hair was even worse than this. I was speaking about another chart with a time I don't know that for Harry Mack, and Harry Mack was also born on a day when the moon changed signs. For Harry, it was from Scorpio to Sagittarius, and I spent some time considering that. For Lee Morgan, from Sagittarius to Capricorn. Well, this is where my bias is going to come in. Like, a lot of the musicians I love, and I love Lee Morgan's music. All right. And again, I suggest you go listen to, where did I have that up? Go listen to Lee Morgan's Live at the Lighthouse record. Go listen to a lot of Lee Morgan records, okay? This is a pretty amazing record, and it's like 3 hours plus of music. I love Lee Morgan's music. I love Eric Deutsch's music, who we were listening to on the way in. I love a lot of musicians who have strong Sagittarius in their chart, and that's because I love adventurous music, I believe, right? And so just looking at, all right, Lee Morgan, whose music I love, had the moon either in the sign of Sagittarius or in Capricorn, I'm kind of inclined to lean towards Sagittarius. And see, that's, in a sense, a great potential mistake. Right? It's like, oh, I think this person's like this, and therefore their chart works this way. And it's also maybe not a mistake, right? We're going to learn astrology through investigation of our own nativities, through the natal charts of people who are close to us, through the natal charts of heroes of ours, perhaps. And I'm very fortunate in my work to be in kind of consistent daily counsel with amazing, powerful, awakening beings who are sharing life stories with me while I'm staring at their birth chart, right? So I'm really getting to learn astrology through reflection of honest storytelling from amazing people, like every day. This is, I've been three sessions before I'm here live today, and we'll have more later today. And if you would like to spend some time talking story with me and looking at your astrology, GeminiBrett.com is the place to be. If you'd like to study some astrology with me, here's a place where you could go currently, GeminiBrett.com/time. Now, I will say there's only one of 4 classes left in this deep dive workshop that I'm currently teaching, but you will find hours of classes and hours of tutorial videos waiting for you there should you choose to join the trip, because it's some of these timing techniques, and not only real time, which is transits, but some of the fractal timing techniques, some of the ancient techniques like circumambulations, primary directions, profections, more modern techniques like progressions and solar arcs that we can also use to rectify charts, because the assumption is that when significant things happen, like being shot by your partner, for example, that we should expect to see really strong astrological images of this. Now, it's hard to get a clean experiment in astrology, because, while Pluto in this moment of Lee Morgan being shot, and by the way, when I say this moment, I don't know that it's 1 a.m. I heard it's in the early hours of February 19th. The show was on February 18th, but it bleeds, as jazz shows should, past midnight, right? And it's said that he was shot, and he actually died, probably would have lived if there wasn't so much snow on the ground in Manhattan that night, because the ambulances couldn't get there quick enough. You might wonder if they cared enough, and that's an interesting thing to explore. And then we bring a lot of our own bias and projections into the astrological symbolism. We need to be careful with this, but it's also something we do, and that doesn't make it wrong right? But yeah, the ambulance couldn't get there fast enough and he bled to death. Um, just brutal, right? So I do see at the 12 p.m. chart, which puts Libra rising. And I'll just say, like, if I look at that chart, well, I look at Libra rising, I'm inclined to go look to Venus. And look, Lee Morgan was a great artist. He was also an amazingly stylish cat. Let me show you some Lee Morgan pictures, right? He was very concerned, as many jazz musicians have been throughout time. Well, sometimes it seems less so now, but with just like dressing beautifully, that was certainly a thing with Lee Morgan. Here's Lee and Wayne Shorter back in the Jazz Messenger days, I think. Um, Anyway, so Venus is a planet who, especially on the Libra energy, even more so than the Taurus energy, her other home, according to the tradition, who loves to look beautiful. Fashion is something we associate with Libra. And so I look to that and I'm like, oh, this 12 p.m. time or other Libra rising times, which would be the next 2.5 hours or so, could really speak for Lee Morgan. I see when I look to Libra, I look to Venus, and I see Venus in the 11th, which is like groups, right? And he spent a lot of times in the fashion of groups as an artist, Venus musician, like I can see that work. Regardless of what time Lee Morgan was born, we're going to see a really strong Sun-Mars conjunction. Less so Sun Pluto, Mars Pluto, but as you can see, it's all there. Like that was true for this entire day called July 10th, 1938, if you're into that whole Gregorian trip, as it was experienced in Philadelphia, PA. Look at the Sun square Saturn. All right, Sun sextile Uranus. Sun at the midpoint of a Uranus-Neptune trine. I mean, almost exactly. The Sun at this 12 p.m. time is only 11 arc minutes from the midpoint of Uranus and Neptune, meaning that Lee Morgan's light is tapped into some like outer planet, invisible, transcendental. Look at Uranus and Taurus, which is happening now as we speak, right? Like I think an interesting thing that we'll also see here, let me not lose this other chart, is that I've been inspired by this film to speak about Lee Morgan as Uranus is transiting his natal Uranus. Like I don't want to ignore that, right? Why am I called in? How does my chart relate to Lee's chart? We want to be careful there because it can really disturb the science, if you will, when we put too much of us in here and our opinions and what we want. But also, how can you not do that? It's not only hard to get a clean experiment in astrology because we have so many variables, right? But it's also hard to do a clean experiment in anything. It's a very important reminder about quote unquote science because we're so interested in the results and want to see it play this way or that. All right. Well, I happen to have this same Sun square Saturn in my nativity, right? So how can I separate what I've experienced in my life, or I believe I've experienced in my life, in resonance with that particular chord of my celestial song with Lee Morgan's, right? I have Saturn overcoming the Sun as well, just in different signs, Scorpio Sun and Leo Saturn for me. Now, if you know something about astrological aspects, you will certainly know about application and separation. At this 12 p.m. time, we see the Sun square with Saturn is almost perfect. It's 1 arc minute out, and it's S for separating because the Sun moves faster than Saturn. So the Sun has already perfected that square and is now on the way. All right. If I go back to like 12 a.m., right, which would be another option for the same day, right? Now I'm seeing that Sun here at 1714 with Saturn at 1740. The aspect geometrically is not as tight, you see. 26 arc minutes, that's about half a degree, 60 minutes in a degree. But A means applying, it's still about to happen. And throughout the tradition, we see that as a stronger thing. All right, if I'm here, Aries rising, well, I'm going to go look to Mars. Mars in Cancer combust, which means Mars can't be seen because it's too close to the Sun. And Mars in the sign of his fall, Well, certainly at the end of Lee Morgan's life, I can see that as a pretty significant kind of descriptor, but it might not be where I go initially. I will say at this time, I get this Mercury trine to the ascendant, which intrigues me. I see Capricorn here at the midheaven, traditionally associated with the planet Saturn, who's said to be in fall in the sign of Aries. And does that describe this work? I don't know. So some of what I'll do, like even before I get into timing techniques, which frankly I'm not going to do so much of today because it takes a long time. I'll introduce some of the ways that I would play with this because I'm recording this not only to share with y'all, but also as a tutorial video, more of kind of a philosophical tutorial video for folks who are currently in my fractal time class. And I would love for you to join us. So geminibrett.com/time if you'd like to learn more about fractal time techniques like progressions, profections, and directions with me. Well, I've been recording tons of tutorial videos and example videos, and one of the most important applications of fractal timing techniques, of all astrological timing techniques, is to know more about our past, but also to help us prepare more for our present and our future, but also to help us understand time, which is necessary if we want to rectify a chart for which we don't know a birth time. I will typically start more archetypally. I've seen so much support for this idea that the planet that is the traditional dispositor, or I like to say guide, of the ascendant has so much to do with who I am, who you are. So again, when I see Libra here, my eyes go straight to Venus. That the planet who's the guide of the 10th whole sign and also the midheaven of the chart, is sometimes different things, will speak so much to this person's like career and how they're known and seen. It's, I mean, maybe especially interesting for people who are famous, like Lee Morgan was and is to many of us, and should be to everyone as far as I'm concerned. And when I see a Cancer midheaven, my eyes go to the moon, who is here in Sagittarius in the third. Well, there's something about moon, like soulful Sagittarius journeys in third expression. And I can see that being Lee Morgan, like no issue. I like seeing Jupiter here in the fifth house, but the sixth whole sign, it's like art and practice combined in a trine with that midheaven degree. Like I could see this totally working, and it's just me choosing 12 p.m. because it puts the moon right in between her 12 a.m. position that, 12 hours before this and 12 hours after this, and the same thing with the sun and all the beings. When I consider this truth that Lee Morgan was shot by his wife, I'm inclined to go look for some of the drama in the chart. And I can see things like Sun, who is the sect light, if Lee Morgan was born by day and we don't know. But I can see the Sun applying to Mars. I can see the Sun squaring Saturn. Can see Uranus and Neptune involved, although in albeit like more friendly ways. That's the sextile. I can see that Mars is applying to Pluto and the Sun as well, And that's going to happen. That's like all happening any time of the day. However, from a traditional point of view, it's going to be more experienced if the native is born with the sun above the ground, if it's daytime versus nighttime, where we might favor more of the moon. All right, well, if the moon was in Capricorn, which was true at night after the sunset, some hours after the sunset, well, that's going to give me kind of a different archetypal image. I do, for the reason I described before, like the Sagittarius moon versus the Capricorn moon for Lee Morgan. I could totally see it go either way, but there is this great adventurous spirit. In fact, one of Lee Morgan's like great songs is like Search for a New Land. Can you hear Sagittarius in that? I can. All right. So anyway, I like a Sagittarius moon. I'm also wondering, like when I look at Libra rising and Aries setting, My eyes are inclined to consider Venus and Mars in the relationship reality. If Libra's rising, like Venus, signifies the native from a traditional point of view, especially if Venus can see the ascendant, which she can here by a whole sign sextile. Mars would represent the wife, the other. And all like dealings, especially contractual, but especially like a spouse, right? Is like just signified by the, to use the old words, the Lord of the seventh house. Seeing Saturn there in fall is interesting. But with Aries, I'm also inclined to go look for Mars. Well, here we have Mars in the 10th. And Helen Morgan, Lee's wife, like once she kind of picked him up out of the gutter of his addiction, helped him like get back to visibility, honors, 10th house, get back to work, 10th house. She served as his manager. She collected the money that helps it not go right into the syringe, you know? And other things, she was very much kind of his business manager because he needed that, maybe not only for that reason. Yeah, so I'm intrigued there too, right? So I could totally see it, you know. And also here's Mars. She shot him. Mars is in fall. Mars is applying to Pluto. There's some danger in that. Mars is like linked in with Uranus here. Mars is linked in with Saturn here. Like I could totally see it. Like I probably, well, I do expect to see some kind of drama between the rulers of the first, me, and the seventh, the other, in a chart where a spouse murders the native. You know, she actually was charged for manslaughter. She pled guilty to second degree manslaughter and actually didn't spend that long in jail. And like later we get to hear in this film, I Called Him Morgan, about her remorse. And there's this kind of, I mean, I don't want to give too much of the film away, but there's this interview with one of his dear friends, like a bandmate. At the end, it was just like, I was just so ready for if I ever saw her again, like what I would do because she killed, you know, Lee. And what I did is I hugged her. And she came in and hugged me and said how just terrible she felt about this. And she didn't want to do that and all this, you know. So it was an intriguing thing to consider. Now, when I look at Lee's chart, I'm like, all right, this Sun-Mars conjunction is super strong. And in one of our timing techniques, by the way, I might be interested, very interested in when that conjunction perfects. So if I go days after Lee's birth, I went 12 days after Lee's birth, and by the way, that looks to be the date. It's certainly when Mars and Pluto conjoined. I meant to go 1 day after Lee's birth, but I just want you to see as I'm clicking through the days, keep your eyes here. You might think that with Mars, who moves much slower than the sun, that it won't take too long for the sun to move these 4.5 degrees to conjoin Mars. Sun moves like 1 degree per day. So in like 4.5 days, here's 5, the sun is going to be where Mars was in the natal chart, but really hasn't closed the gap. When Lee Morgan was born, this is when Mars is most fast from Earth's point of view, is when Mars and sun are conjoined. And we can't see it because Mars is literally blinded by the light of the sun. It's like behind the sun at this time. But when Lee Morgan was born, the sun was moving 57 minutes per day, about a degree per day is the sun. And Mars is moving 39 degrees per day, right? There's not that much difference. So it's actually, Mars is the most difficult planet for the sun to catch. So let's see when it is that Mars is conjoined by sun. And I speak it that way, always speak the name of the faster moving planet first. I will just say there's something really intriguing here on July 22nd when Lee Morgan is 12 days old, because Mars is conjoined Pluto, sun's coming into the mix now. Mars is going to change signs. Sun changes signs, right? This is July 23rd now. And then eventually the sun is going to catch up to Mars, pass Mars by. It looks like it's around this time. Astrological software will help me like find the exact moment, and it's July 24th, 1938, 3:07 p.m. And so Lee Morgan here is 14 days old. Now, one of our fractal timing techniques is secondary progressions, where we will turn those days into years. What? And we would expect something in Lee Morgan's like experiential life at 14 years of age to be reflective of this very powerful astronomical event when he was 14 days old. The weirdest thing about fractal time techniques, like in that case, secondary progressions, is they work. I mean, why we would ever expect to find something that happens when we are 14 days old show up when we are 14 years old just seems absolutely ridiculous, you know? But when you study these things, you find they work, and it just opens up all sorts of other levels of cosmology, philosophy, and frankly, weirdness. So again, I'm in the midst right now of teaching a fractal time workshop, like a deep dive. And if you're interested in pursuing some of the philosophy and the technique behind progressions, perfections, directions, solar arcs, and more, like circumambulations, GeminiBrett.com/time, y'all. All right, let me get back to Lee Morgan. So there's something here that I'd be intrigued by. Now, as I said earlier, and I say often, it's hard to get a clean experiment in astrology. Regardless of Lee Morgan's rising sign or birth time, Mars was conjoined by Sun on July 24th, 1938 at 3:07:36 p.m. in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Now, if he was born at 3:07 p.m., this is when he's exactly 14 days old. If he's born at 3 a.m., he's 14 and a half days old. And so did something show up when he was exactly 14 years old or exactly 14 and a half years old? Well, sadly, the fractal time things, they tend to be not as like discrete or precise when you're speaking about an exact moment. Some argue that they are. Some, like Charles Jane, who wrote many books, including this wonderful text, Progressions and Directions, feels like we should have very significant precision in what we're doing, and that the reason why we can't is because we haven't rectified birth times. Others, like Robert Blaschke, and this is a really wonderful text, Astrology, A Language of Life, is a series of 6 books by the great Robert Blaschke, who sadly also left Earth at a very young age. His first volume of the 6-volume series, Progressions, is an intriguing, trippy, spiritually based progression book that I also recommend. It's a little bit more on the sacred than the science in some regards. It's certainly coming from both places. Charles Jane's very scientific, very precise, and he argues that we should be able to see these things kind of expressing themselves within weeks or months maximum, where most modern astrologers are like, it's like sometime in that year. It's like hard to say. And Charles Jane's is like, well, that's because you're doing it wrong because you haven't rectified the birth time, for example. Anyway, when Lee Morgan is only a couple days older than this, we're going to see this Leo new moon conjunct Mars, right? And very close to Pluto, though now over the sign cusp. Here we're looking at July 16th. He's 16 years old, If he got recruited by Dizzy when he's 18 years old, like he better be playing trumpet really well at 16 years old. So at 16 days old, through secondary progressions, we turn that into 16 years old. Let's look a couple days later about when Moon is conjunct Mercury in Virgo, right? And now he's 18 days old. So if this is something in his 18-year expression that might speak of him being recruited to play in Dizzy's band, I mean, bands are 11th house. They are groups. We do see at this point a sextile from Mercury and the Moon to this particular midheaven we found at 12 p.m. Like, I could see that working from a whole sign perspective. And I'm always also looking at whole sign frameworks. This is going to be in the 12th, and I'm maybe a little bit less sure. I would maybe see the moon moving through the 12th more akin to some of Lee Morgan's issues with addictions, which my understanding is that didn't start till later in his life when he was playing in Art Blakey's band and later left Art Blakey's band as a result, because Art wasn't into that stuff from what I know. Mercury opposite Jupiter, like there's always so many variables in astrology that again, it's hard to get a clean experiment. So let me just rewind and speak more about this archetypally and not moving through time, but in this one moment of Lee Morgan's birth or looking for that single moment. Again, I'm like, well, one of the most intense experiences of his life is being shot by his wife, obviously, his death. And what if I take this square, which is rather harsh between Sun and Saturn, and have Sun and Saturn signify the native and the spouse? Well, how would I do that? I would look at a Leo rising chart, because opposite Leo is Aquarius, traditionally guided by Saturn, right? In Leo, the sun. Or I could do an Aquarius rising chart where Saturn would represent the native Aquarius rising and Sun would represent the other. But I'm going to go here because Saturn's overcoming the Sun in that story sounds similar, and I'm going to go some hours back and look at Leo rising's charts. Well, here's one at 9 a.m. with Venus standing on the ascendant, right? And so I'm not Libra rising anymore, and so Venus maybe is not as strong, but anytime planets are angular, they certainly are. I could see this work well. I mean, Uranus at the Taurus midheaven, like Lee Morgan changed the world through his beauty and his art. Mars sextile the midheaven, I can see coming blowing through his trumpet. He was a powerful player. I'm looking at this moon in the fifth whole sign, trining Leo or Venus at the ascendant. There's a lot of artists, and I actually really like this 9 a.m. chart. But let me go back, because Leo will be rising for more than 2 hours in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania every day. And I'm a little bit more interested that though the sun here ruling the Leo ascension is in the 12th whole sign, it's in the 11th house of groups, which can make sense for a musician like that for sure. But there's just something in the addiction. There's something in this very strange death that feels very much like the Lord of the First and the 12th. And I can't know. But it's one thing, like when I start playing with fractal timing techniques, I want a few different places to start. I kind of like that 12 p.m. chart. I like the 9 a.m. chart. Here I am at 8 a.m. and I'm intrigued by that. I'm kind of like seeing this image just because of this story of these beings in the 12th. We still get Venus in the first sign. I kind of get like a midpoint of the ascendant between Mercury and Venus, which makes sense for an artist who's communicating, like, on one level, joy, passion, radiance, art. Looking at Jupiter here, Jupiter's now in the 8th whole sign. Pisces is the 8th of Leo. Very rewind time a little bit more. He's going to be up in the 8th house. This isn't long after Leo started rising here at 7 a.m. Looking at an Aries midheaven and that Mars in Cancer in the 12th. Taurus is the 10th whole sign, and so this Leo Venus ruling the 10th. You see here, at least in this Placidus house, so now coming into the 2nd, I like this image more of Venus in the 1st. I like the image of Venus rising, frankly. So that's at 9 a.m. time. But here at 8 a.m., which brings the sun down into the 1st, into the 12th, at least of a Placidus house system, which I feel speaks to this story, not only of his terrible death, but also of like his time as a junkie and his time just of invisibility. Like one of the interviews in this documentary, I called him Morgan, which was a musician who very much like respected Lee. And he said he was like in the subway and saw this like homeless person, but it was like he was like, oh my God, that's Lee Morgan. It was just a time when Lee was like kind of really in the throes of his addiction, showing up at shows in slippers because he had pawned his shoes for junk, or when he met Helen, he didn't have a coat even though it was freezing outside in the winter of New York, and it's because he had just pawned his coat for junk. And some of that 12th house strength can speak to that. Again, hard to get a clean experiment in astrology. There's all sorts of things I can do, including just having the sun between Uranus and Neptune, which is true like all day, to see some of that essence, right? There's many things that can speak of drugs and addictions in astrology. So again, it's hard to get a clean experiment, as you'll often hear me say. Depending on how I play with astrology, I might look to divisions of signs like the 10 degrees divisions of the decans. Does Lee Morgan feel, if it is Leo rising, more kind of Saturnian or more Jupiterian or more Martian? I might look to other divisions, and I do, like the Egyptian terms or bounds. And I might look up here at the midheaven as much as I do with the ascendant, for example. When Leo's rising, I'm looking to the sun and thinking about something in hidden places and invisibility and self-sabotage and other 12th house things, hidden enemies, intriguingly, a part of his story, right? But I'm also, perhaps because the sun cannot see the ascendant, going to use some other techniques like who are the triplicity lords of the ascendant. And by day for the fire signs, that's the sun and Jupiter, but they're both in invisible places from a whole sign perspective. That's the 12th and the 8th. And so then I go to Saturn, who interestingly is in fall, and there's a lot of, Lee's story that maybe can be described by Saturn. I mean, I might rewind time and see when Venus's bounds are arising. We have Venus in the first, ruling the 10th. That tends to be I work for myself as an artist, like on the stage expressing beauty, right? And by the way, I would read that if I knew nothing about this person, right? But that really works for me for this jazz musician whose music is so beautiful. I might rewind time and see when it was that Venus's bounds were rising. And I go back here, it looks like to 742. We move into the bounds of Saturn, which, by the way, also speaks, for this terrible experience. So, you can see how hard this is to do just archetypally. Especially, it's like the more astrology you learn, the more precise you can get and exact you can get, but it also goes the other way because you start learning like, oh, wow, Neptune can work like Venus in some regards, or whatever. Those of you who have been studying this craft understand where I'm coming from. I do like the image of the moon in the 5th. This is a very creative soul. Though we do not have children, I like the image of moon applying to trine Venus, which was happening for another couple hours after this time. It would be alive in that 9 a.m. chart I had looked at too. I'm wondering up here with Aries, because while Taurus is the 10th whole sign of the Leo design, no matter what, I might want to see that midheaven degree also in Taurus rather than in Aries, just given Lee's work. I could see a 12th house Mars like working, doing the thing, but I'm not sure. So let's see what time it was that we get the midheaven moving to the sign of Taurus. Intriguingly, in Philadelphia, watch what happens. I have to get to this 7:42 minute where now I have Taurus up at the midheaven, and I'm just in the last minutes, arc minutes, or even it looks like arc seconds of the ascendant being in the bounds of Venus that's here. All right. So, I mean, like, if I wanted to work that, the Leo ascendant in the bounds of Venus with the Taurus midheaven, which begins, by the way, also with Venus at the bounds, then I got like 7:42 a.m. because I think the very next minute we're in the bounds of Saturn here. And indeed, we are. I also see this is the day of the sun. That means Sunday. And it's in the hour of Venus, which for those who really kind of connect to magical time might also prefer for an artist, a jazz musician, especially one who's so beautifully dressed and fashionable as Lee Morgan was when he was healthy. So I don't know, here's a time to play with 7:42 a.m. for many of those reasons I've described. I like it in Lee's chart in a gazillion ways. I might want to like strengthen the Mercury connection to the midheaven degree, but I also like this Jupiter connection to the midheaven. And I wonder about Venus's bounds here. Although I've got to say, just the way that his life kind of went through hardship, and certainly at the end, I might look more to this Leo ascendant in the bounds of Saturn. And then I'm actually perfecting this Jupiter sextile to the midheaven. I mean, the dude was famous, like while he was alive, you know. I'm strengthening this Moon Venus trine. So when I was playing with this chart yesterday, this is the time I had like, I'm not going to say settled on, but decided I would use to begin my investigation, where then I'm going to utilize fractal timing techniques. Doesn't this seem to be the right time to say, hey, by the way, I'm currently teaching a fractal timing technique class, and if you're interested in learning about progressing, perfecting, and directing your chart, join us. If you're hearing this at a time that I currently perceive to be the future, the classes are waiting for you there with hours and hours of tutorials and recorded study groups and pages of resources and recommended readings, and it will be yours for $99. Friends, actually, you know what? How about I tell you this? There's a coupon code if you go to geminibrett.com/time. Oh, why don't I just do that and show you how it might work? That will actually take some money off the price of that thing. And that coupon code is friends. So geminibrett.com. Well, stars will take you to a fixed stars class, but time will take you to the fractal time class. And if in all caps you type in friends, that 99 turns into 89.10. It's a ridiculous amount of astrological study for a very low price as far as I'm concerned. I think most folks in the classes would tell you that that's also true. 3 hour live classes, that's more like 4 hours and yada yada. Anyway, check it out. Would love to see you there in the time I currently perceive to be the future or even the past. If you can somehow work that, time does have this fractal vibe. All right, well, let me just show you some places where I go to play with this. So like if I'm looking at this time, there's really key times in Lee Morgan's life, right? So like 33 years old, he dies. 18 years old, he joins Dizzy Gillespie, okay? 18, by the way, like is a seventh house annual profection. Any year that is divisible by 6, but not by 12 like 18 is. And so if I'm observing that, well, I might not feel that the Aquarius rising map is the best description of Lee Morgan getting called into this like big gig, because the Lord of the seventh, when it's Aquarius, Leo rising, is Saturn, and Saturn's in Aries in fall. But you know, Saturn often represents older folks. And Dizzy Gillespie was an elder, you know. I mean, he wasn't old yet, but he was like an elder statesman in jazz, and he brought the very young Lee Morgan in and kind of like was showing the young Lee off. And amazing, Dizzy Gillespie is so cool, you know, like he and many who witnessed this felt that Dizzy's trumpet playing was actually challenged by this kid, Lee Morgan. And Dizzy didn't try to hide Lee Morgan away because he's like a musical competitor or something. He brought him into the band because he was like a musical collaborator. And how cool is that, right? Like, I love these statesmen in jazz who bring in young musicians to like give them an opportunity, but it also like drives them, yeah? And you can feel some of that in the Aries kind of competitiveness and the Saturn kind of elder statement. Saturn's in the third sign from Aquarius, from the seventh, and in the ninth whole sign of this Leo rising design, which we're not sure of. But actually, I could see that totally speaking because the ninth is travel, right? And this is Lee Morgan joining Dizzy's big band, and they're traveling all over the place, you know? And it launches his career when he would turn um, 19, he gets into an eighth house year, things are going to change in a big way, and Jupiter lives there. So profections are an intriguing technique to consider. I want like pretty specific dates when I go there. By the way, speaking of specific dates, let's bring this back in. This is a transit chart for 1 a.m. in New York around the time that Lee Morgan dies. The sun is in the last degree of Aquarius. Look at where Saturn is. So Lee Morgan has Sun square Saturn. It's the opening square of their cycle, and at this time it's Sun square Saturn. It's the closing square of the cycle. But I'm kind of intrigued by that because, again, like one of the things that brought me to this idea of a Leo rising time for him is because then he's going to be represented by the sun, at least for some perspectives. Sun will be his steersman, maybe not what's called the Almutin or other things that would look for a planet to represent Lee, but Sun is the steersman of any Leo rising chart. And then Aquarius setting, and traditionally I'm inclined to look towards Saturn, and we have that strong Sun-Saturn square applying in this case with Saturn overcoming the Sun, overcoming Mars. And then later when I cast this time of his death, it's like, oh, damn. And Sun, which represents him, and Saturn, which represents the other, are also square at that time, and he's shot by his wife. While he's on a gig, while Mars, right, which is guns, by the way, is in the 10th if Lee's born with Leo rising, right? And he's shot like on a gig. So I'm not going to use that only to say, oh, well, that means he has to be Leo rising. But it's feeling interesting. Again, it's hard to get a clean experiment in astrology. If I'm looking at the transit chart, I have Mars squaring his natal Mercury. So how might that show up, right? At 33 years of age, we are all in what are called 10th house annual profections. Well, if Leo rising, that means Taurus. And if Taurus, I'm inclined to go look at transits to and transits by Venus. And the sun is opposite Venus, but oh, Saturn's squaring Venus. And you know what happened is his wife is angered that he's like literally bringing another woman home. He wasn't like that. He was so like described as like loving of Helen Morgan, and that they toured to like she was on tour with him and whatnot. And at some point he went for this younger woman, you know, and she obviously didn't like that much, especially when she was disrespected by him at this club. And she describes that she has this gun in her purse. It fell out of the purse. He gave her the gun to be able to protect herself, and she lost control and went in and shot him. So interestingly, we see Venus, who, if Leo rising is the lady of the year, she in the nativity is being squared by Saturn. And she's also in Aries in the sign of her fall. Like, I'm intrigued by that. She's in a mutual reception here with Mars. Mars, if I'm ascendant in Taurus year, the descendant is Scorpio, traditionally represented by Mars. And there's a bit of an intriguing thing there, especially since it happened in his place of work, which is out at the club. By the way, he was playing a place called Slugs, you know, which is a word people use for bullets. That's weird, right? Venus, Chiron. Yeah. I mean, there's ways that I feel the profections, which help us understand something about chronocrators or time lords, can work here. Importantly, it's not the only Time Lord technique. But let's look at some of the fractal time things. So one, he's 33 years old. That's how I get to a 10th house annual profection. That's true for me and you at 33. He's many months into that year, which begins for him in July. So July, August, September, October, November, January, February. He's in the 7th month of his year, which would have started around February 10th-ish. So if he's in a Taurus year, then he's in a Mars month of a Taurus year. Astro Gold software will show that this way. It's 1972 in February. Oh, did I count it on my fingers wrong? I did. Started in the wrong place. It's a 10th house year, Taurus, if Leo rising. It's the 9th month, the 8th month of the year, which intriguingly, 8th and death have something to do with one another in astrology. But it's actually a Jupiter month of a Venus year, if and only if Lee Morgan was born with Leo rising. And what's up with Jupiter? Oh, Mercury's visiting the natal Jupiter, transiting Jupiter's in fall in Capricorn. There is a bit of a Venus-Jupiter square happening here, but I don't know. Now, if he was born with the moon in Capricorn, then Jupiter was transiting that Capricorn moon. If he was born with the moon in Capricorn, he's definitely not Leo rising, right? These challenging things. But look at Jupiter square Pluto. Yeah, I mean, that's an intriguing thing. And looking to the natal Jupiter, right? It's Mercury's transiting Jupiter. Saturn has a very strong square with Jupiter. It hasn't perfected yet. Saturn has to move into the sign of Gemini, where then he will perfect a square with Jupiter, but certainly geometrically it's on. Those are the things that jump off the screen. Now the parts of spirit and fortune are going to be very keyed to the birth moment. So I'm not sure about Jupiter's connections to them. I definitely see that Jupiter was sextile his natal Jupiter, and usually you wouldn't see a sextile meaning like death. And surprisingly, you learn in astrology to actually expect Jupiter in death charts, which would just shock you when you first learn about Jupiter. There's so much to say about that, but I want to leave that there. All right. One technique we might look in fractal world, so he's 33 and a half-ish years old, is called solar arcs, where we basically just move everything forward by about 1 degree per year. So I might be interested in what do we have that are 33 degrees away from something else. And one thing that just caught my eye right away, because I looked here to the ascendant, and I did it math wrong. What happens if I add 33 to this? I get to 7 Leo. So what's called solar arc Chiron is going to be pretty close to the natal Mercury. I was looking at the ascendant. That wouldn't be true. But if the ascendant was 7 Leo, like so some many minutes before that time I was looking at, then he would have Chiron's solar arc to the ascendant at this time when he was shot. I just want to put a solar arc chart on here. In fact, I'm going to put, this would be a lot to see, but we're going to add in this moment, which I've cast of 1 a.m. February 19th, 72. I'm going to add a secondary progress chart. And the solar arc directed, they say, but solar arcs are really perfections chart. And then look at the transit chart as well. So this is one way, this is for the kind of modern fractal time techniques where I like to observe a moment. And of course it becomes kind of overwhelming when we have 4 charts on the screen at once. So let me just show you one of these at a time. This would be secondary progressions. I mean, interestingly, Pluto has just recently changed signs, but Pluto moves so slowly and so do progressions. You need to be particularly careful with items like that. Sun has recently squared Uranus, but it really would have happened more like a year before. 2 years before. There's the Sun Uranus square, right? So I would imagine that that's expressing itself somehow in Lee's life. I mean, I am looking at the full moon at the time, square Uranus, and looking at that moon in the seventh, I wouldn't be so shocked if that's when this kind of like other woman came into the world, if this was his ascendant. I'm looking at Mars crossing the ascendant the year-ish before. And all these things intrigue me, but with secondary progressions and other fractal timing techniques like this, we want to use really tight orbs. Like this is something the Sun Uranus, though it can really describe that experience he had, that shocking traumatic experience. It's not something I would actually expect in this chart. It would have been earlier in his life. I don't know that that much is like jumping off the screen at me right now in this regard. I am looking at Venus, and so that 12 p.m. time with those early degrees of Libra rising were intriguing in this regard. But I will say that like this image of secondary progressions for Lee Morgan make less sense to me. But look at 1335 Mars in Leo. I mean, given that he shot at this time, if I go back to the changing the birth time, what happens if I change this to 1330 whatever, and then look at that secondary progression? And I might want to cast it again, because the angles will look different. But then we have the secondary progressed Mars crossing the ascendant, and well, I mean, this would be way too literal of an experience of what that could bring, but happened. Then the moon's also moving through the progressed eighth, which is typically a time where we're asked to explore a rebirth. You also see, and I had missed this before, that the progressed moon is opposite Mercury. And I'm intrigued by that. Mercury, who represents the 11th, and he's out playing with the group, who represents the second. One of the themes of the second, in my point of view, is survival. The moon representing the 12th of hidden things, and I mean, even hidden enemies. So that can be intriguing, but you know, this is me like knowing something about this event and then searching for it in the chart rather than like seeing a chart and contemplating what the event can be. And so, I mean, we don't always have to be scientific in our astrological approach. Again, it's hard to be, but you know, you can kind of cast any chart, and this is one of the challenges of astrology and my skepticism of it, and like find a story in any, you know, find the story in every chart. It's just some that are like much more literal. And I wonder about this 7:55 a.m. chart just because of secondary progressed Mars crossing the ascendant. Look, that's the only way I got there, okay? So I'm gonna just maybe leave it there for a second, and then let's look at the solar arc chart from that birth time, because where this ascendant lives is going to be a direction from that ascendant degree. I see it's close to Mercury, but actually when the ascendant was a few degrees before, which is what I had up at like 7:47 a.m., then we would have a solar arc directed to Mercury. And though I would not necessarily see that as describing a death in a Leo rising chart, it's an intriguing thing to notice, right? I mean, this is just like the amazing challenge with with fractal time-ish. I'm also kind of shocked as to why these, especially, oh, I see. why those don't agree. That there's many different ways to calculate progressed angles. These are truly progressed angles. Um, and so I'm just kind of shopping around and looking for connections and things. All right. So let's just look at this solar arc chart alone. And now I'm arcing from a 7:55 a.m. birth time. I'm seeing, oh, moon opposite Mars, but really that happened 5 years ago. I'm seeing moon opposite Pluto, but that actually won't happen for another 3 years, right? So, and that's just because the entire solar arc charts are perfecting around at a rate of about 1 degree per year. I'm seeing Mars, Venus here. Now I can't change the rising sign and accelerate that. um, so this is very much like the year after this time, and most of us with solar arcs use really tight orbs, like half a degree on either side. And so while I'm like not going to sleep on that's there, it's also in a sense not there yet. Like Saturn was at Uranus a couple years before. There's something I'm just noticing in these techniques from a couple years before that's a big deal. And I imagine that was like, I mean, that was probably this like Lee Morgan live at the lighthouse period, frankly. Can't remember when that went down, but there are certainly places where I could find out, right? Yeah, so here we go, live at the lighthouse in July of 1970. In this film, I called him Morgan. This was described as like a really happy time between Lee and his wife, Helen. While I'm here, I just want to check in with any comments that might be happening for those of you who are witnessing this live. So, is this live? Let me see if I can see any comments here. Oh my gosh, it says this is a private video. Well, so nobody's here live, and hopefully I can change that later. So this will at least show up for some of you who subscribe to my channel. If you're seeing this at all, I managed to do so. And if you are here and you are not subscribed to my channel, please do. If you've made it this long, that means you are at least intrigued. So please do subscribe to the channel and share this video around with other star seekers like us who you feel might enjoy the thing. All right. I'm going to go to a really wonderful site online, astroseek.com, where I can play with many different astrological techniques. And thanks to Peter for this site, because I can do so for free. I cast 7:47 a.m. here. That was the chart that I was kind of digging yesterday, but I'm going to try this 7:55. Things won't change much here. I'm still seeing the ascendant in the terms of Saturn and the midheaven in the terms of Venus. But some of the timing techniques will shift. If I want to look at these perfections, for example, I want to check out a specific date. And in this case, why don't we go to this February 19th, 1972. And then this will help me see things like that he was in, as I described before, a 10th house perfection. And if and only if Leo is rising, that means Taurus. And if Taurus, that means Venus. And then we'll pay particular attention to transits to and transits by Venus. So I'll open a transit chart and just look at what Venus is up to at that time. As we had seen before, she was in the sign of Aries. She's conjunct Chiron, who doesn't show up on this map because they're showing us traditional planets. But they show me Chiron's degrees here. And I can go down and look at aspects. And I mean, even if I want to look at maybe tighter orbs, I can or looser, I can just dig into aspects to and by Venus, who's said to be the chronometer as the lady of the year. And that might intrigue me, and it might be things that I can find as like potential verifications of this time that I'm pursuing, okay? So I'm not going to do all of this, as I said before, I'm doing a lot more than I thought I would. But just to kind of share some of the approaches for rectification. There's the idea of continuous profections might help me really honor some more specific timings. And I'm looking here, wow, look at this, is exact on February 19th, 1972. I'm trying to think, just technically speaking, if that is as true from different birth times. I mean, frankly, I just can't resist going to find out. So I'm going to change this birth time to like 4:55 p.m. And then, yeah, they changed by a few days. But still, they're right in that zone. Let me go back to this 7:55 a.m. time I was working with. Because it's pretty intriguing to see that these are called continuous profections. These perfections are exact alignments on this date of February 19th when he dies. They're both Mercury, Saturn opposite. So this is called continuously profected Saturn opposite natal Mercury. And when profected Saturn is opposing something, Sun's going to be squaring it, because Lee Morgan's born with this almost perfect Sun-Saturn square. Mercury's been showing up a bunch here, and that makes me wonder if it's more like a Mercury rising chart, like if I was only going to hang my hat on this one technique. Mercury, so Virgo rising, sorry, so Mercury representing the native, Leo, Mercury in the second, Pisces, Jupiter representing the seventh and in the seventh. I don't see it as much in the story. There is an inconjunct there. I could also go to Gemini rising with the Leo, Mercury in the third. I could see that speaking, but then Jupiter also representing the seventh, Sagittarius, if Gemini is rising. The story just feels a little bit less signified than in the Sun-Saturn relationship of Leah Morgan's nativity. But hopefully this is helping you kind of get a feel for the difficulties of doing rectification work. So yeah, I mean, last thing I'll share, well, there's two more things. So one is AstroSeek is my kind of go-to place for what are called circumambulations through the bounds. And I probably expect some kind of significant change in 72 around that time. And there's nothing here. Now that's definitely going to change with the rising sign. So here we see like Venus kind of starting in 1968. This is the 7:55 a.m. If I move this through time, that's going to change. Jupiter opposite the what's called directed ascendant in 1961, but that's very much dependent upon the birth time, and so that's going to change. And so one of the ancient plays for rectifying charts was looking at what are called primary directions and circumambulations of the directed ascendant through the zodiac. That's a mouthful, and again, I will refer you to fractal time, so geminibrett.com/time, if you would like to study more about that with me, where I'll be introducing the techniques of primary directions and through the bound, a very powerful and ancient technique that's sadly not utilized enough anymore. And it's one of the ancient plays for rectifying a chart. All right. AstroSeek also has this wonderful birth time rectification device. And therein, I have one open already. They're using primary directions and what are called direct and converse aspect of the planets to the relocated angles. And then they give you this option to just move the chart time through by seconds, right? This one is 7:47 a.m. So I wonder what happens if I move to that 7:55 a.m. I just want to look here in 72 at this 7:47 a.m. time that I put in. We have Uranus in 1969, and these things, it's hard to say how long they last. We have Moon square, converse the midheaven in 72. Neither of those really feel like the symbol of this thing, okay? I was wondering about Sun and Saturn, and there's these things happening in 1968 in that regards. Converse Saturn, a converse primary direction to the ascendant, squaring the ascendant, and then Sun to the ascendant. Like I could see those ones speaking. And then the other time I want to look to is this when this movie comes out. When was that again? It was written down here somewhere. September 1st, 2016, March 24th, 2017. I mean, I would use Were I Truly Rectifying Lee Morgan's chart. And like when somebody pays me to, it's like that's a long time for me. But I would use all sorts of different important dates, like probably many of these records, for example. But let's see how 2016, early 2017 shows up through this demonstration of primary directions, specifically keyed to the 7:47 a.m. birth time that I was interested in. And we see down here, oh, see that Sun-Saturn? So I'm intrigued by that because this Sun-Saturn square feels so much like this story. But I'd like to move those a little earlier in time, but if I did that, then the ones in 72 are going to move earlier in time and further from the event of his death. So anyway, I'm going to go later in time first. I'm going to go to this 7:55 a.m. time. And you're just going to see that things move quite dramatically because in primary direction reality, 4 minutes of the spinning sky is equivalent to 1 year of life. So if I change 8 minutes in time, I'm literally going to change these events or when they express in life by 2 years. So let's see what happens now in 72 when I moved from 7:47 a.m. to 7:55 a.m. The Sun-Saturn thing I was kind of thinking I would see, they went in the other direction. That means for the movie here, oh, I was going to say, I thought we would see them line up more. Oh yeah, here, this Sun-Saturn in 2016. Here's the, oh, direct to the ascendant in 2019. Now that's intriguing to me. So what I want to do here, and this is just like on a whim, but I want to move this primary directed converse Saturn to the ascendant to 1972. So I think I need to actually go back in time. So if I want to change this by 2 years, I should move 8 minutes. But that's exactly where we were. Let me see what happens there, 4 minutes. There is 69, so I need to go forward in time. So that's the 7:55. All right, this should bring them about 2 years forward. And I'm not even sure I'm sold on converse primary directions anyway. If I was letting that steer the ship, I'd actually want to go about a half year before those, and then this is keyed to a 8:01 a.m. birth time. And then I do get that converse Sun conjunct the ascendant May 30th, 92 with Saturn April 3rd, 72. Why not bring him closer to the February 9th event, February 19th event? And then here I am January 3rd and February 29th surrounding the event of his death. This is an 8 a.m. birth time then. And then let me go down to the movie release in late 2016, early 2017. And I'm in like late 2017, early 2018 there. Anyway, that's kind of an intriguing thing. Now, if I want to utilize specific alignments to get close to a time, then I'm going to look at other specific alignments to look at other times. And, you know, all the ancients, moderns too, who actually utilize this brilliant technique of primary directions aren't in any way suggesting that the event happens on the very day considered, that they have some reach, and even before they happen, they might be happening. But let's just cast 8 a.m. to end our current trip. 15th degree of Leo rising. And so should I like then solar arc to the date of Lee Morgan's tragic death? It was that Mars Venus thing that kind of most intrigued me. The ascendant's coming to Neptune here, but too far away. But now we do get the ascendant connecting into Uranus, which I find intriguing. The midheaven to the lot of spirit. Moon's still a few years away from Pluto. Let's look at the secondary progressions. Yeah, and so here's Mars ascendant. Now in this case, it kind of hasn't quite happened, and that's why I was at that 7:55 a.m. birth time. Maybe more inclined towards that shape. I'll just finish saying this is one of the other great challenges of rectification through our timing techniques is if you choose to learn many timing techniques, and if you're learning astrology, I really highly suggest you do, right? Like it's one thing to see a transit activating a chart. It's a great thing to see. But there's other techniques that will say which transits are stronger at a particular time. There's other techniques like fractal timing techniques that will also help you look through the lens of like secondary progressions, solar arc directions, minor directions, tertiary directions, circumambulations, etc. And while sometimes, and I think you've seen that here, it's like, oh, that can just be like, make it more difficult. Like this technique says this time, this technique says that time, right? When you find the right birth time, it's like all of the techniques seem to sync. And by the way, we might be getting close, but I might be completely barking up the wrong rising tree because that also like didn't necessarily happen. I mean, I would spend hours and hours and hours and hours. Like when I do a proper rectification for somebody, it costs a lot of money because it's a lot of my time. But I definitely found times that I'm very confident in for people, because that's a really nice thing about learning multiple timing techniques. Like you might, when you're looking at a chart, for this year or next year or whatever, find something that's like kind of clearly speaking about a particular event. And you're like, oh, that seems really clear. And then you hear it again from the language of a different timing technique, and again from another, and again from another technique. Then it's like you can speak that with some pretty significant confidence. So I think one of the warnings against technical astrology and adding technique after technique after technique is you can really get away from the art of the chart, which starts in the heart, right? Because techniques can be very mental. But if you can learn to like deal with them all and live in these many different kind of fractal time places simultaneously, it can open the present of the present moment multidimensionally. There's really no words for it. That's the best I can do. Thanks for spending some time here with me, dancing to these weird words of astrology. I hope you've enjoyed yourself. If you are not subscribed to my channel, maybe this convinced you to do just that and to ring the bell and to please spread the word. If you'd be interested in observing some timing techniques for you from the past, present, or future, GeminiBrett.com/sessions is a place where you can book a reading with me. And I would love to have that honor of tuning into the song of your soul with you. GeminiBrett.com/time if you want to learn more about these fractal timing techniques. GeminiBrett.com/courses, or just GeminiBrett.com and travel around that place if you want to learn more about what I do. Thanks for spending some time here with me today. I will